Hello, my name is Dr. Amber Hughes. This is the 8th episode of this career counseling series. In this episode, I'm going to talk about assessment and career counseling. Assessment has a very special place in career counseling. It's really integral to the history of career counseling. You'll find career assessments online for free, at your career counseling center, on the college campus, in your high school. Honestly, they are all over. So what I want to do in this episode is break down the types of assessments you might use, talk about what to consider when using assessments, and discuss how you might go about choosing an assessment for your client. What I'm not going to do is go into the details of each assessment for you. That you can do on your own, but in this episode, I'm going to give more of an overview. First, let's look at some definitions of assessment. So what is it? What is career assessment? Career assessment has a long history in career counseling, like I mentioned. You'll find a career counselor administering and interpreting an assessment for an individual. You'll also see kind of large-scale assessment giving in high school and colleges paired with maybe a computer interpretation or group interpretation of the results. For example, when I was in high school and probably when many of you were in high school, you were administered the ASVAB, and that's an interest inventory. So we had to take this assessment, and then our school counselor came in and handed us the results back. Probably he talked a little bit about it and gave like a group interpretation, but I really don't remember it. All I remember is that it told me I was going to be a housekeeper. And so I basically kind of just laughed at it. And you'll hear those kinds of stories a lot, I'm sure, and maybe some of you have experienced those kinds of stories. When I've given large-scale assessments, which I have, when I was working as a career counselor, as a school counselor, we would do the same thing, only we would try, especially when I was working at the Career Center, where we did this quite often, we would do group assessments and interpretations, but we would really spend a lot of time on those interpretations. So there's different ways, and I'll talk about that later, but there's different ways to do these large scale kind of assessments better, to try and make them more individualized. As with everything else I've talked about up until now, the major differences in assessments lies within your theoretical approach. So if you're aligning more with postmodern theories, you'll prefer qualitative assessments. And qualitative assessments are instruments and activities that use qualitative research methods like open-ended questions and prolonged engagement. So what that means is you're spending a longer amount of time with the individual. These ones are harder to do in group settings than the quantitative assessments because of that engagement piece. To gather information to assist an individual in career development. And that was taken from the Busaka and Rifus book, that definition. If you like the traditional theories like Holland and Parsons, you may prefer quantitative assessments. And quantitative career assessments use quantitative measures with standardized formats and administration based on the instrument, not on the individual. Okay, so qualitative assessments are tailored to the individual and depend on the individual to really make it work. Quantitative assessments have been validated and are considered extremely reliable depending on the type you use. But they're a standardized format, and you have to administer it based on the instrument. And what that means is typically, especially the ones, again, that are reliable and valid, they are pretty straightforward, very standard in how you have to administer them. So the instructions you give, the questions that the individuals answer, your interpretation of it, there's really no room for change. You're doing it based on the protocol from the instrument. All that being said, no matter what your preference, I recommend that you intentionally choose assessments for your clients based on what you hope to find out. So you go forward with intention and purpose with your assessments, not just be like, hey, I love qualitative stuff, so I'm only going to use qualitative assessments, or I really like the strong interest inventory, so I'm going to give it to everyone. Okay, that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is really assess the individual, and by assess, I mean do more of an intake. Again, which we'll talk about later, but figure out what the person in front of you needs, what their goal is, and then determine what assessment you're going to use based on their goals and needs. Brown has identified some expected outcomes of career assessment to help guide you through the process of choosing and using assessments. So first, you might, the first outcome you might expect is for your client to develop a readiness to make a career decision. So kind of where are they at in the process? Are they even ready to make a decision? Are they at a point where they are like 3 or 4 steps from making a decision? Are they at a point where they're just, a freshman in high school, so that's not really something we want to even encourage? So the expected outcome is to determine the readiness to make a career decision, develop confidence that he or she can make a wise decision, right? How confident, or the term we use whenever we talk about this is self-efficacy. What kind of self-efficacy does that person have to make a career decision? Develop self-awareness, and this is where you're going to see a lot of assessments lie, is in that self-awareness domain. So this is where your interests and your personality and your values, all of those are going to fall into that. And so you want to make sure that's where your client's at. Do they need to develop self-awareness? Because if not, you don't want to use one of those assessments. Develop a future orientation. Again, this falls more in line with making a career decision, but also talking in terms of personality, also depending on the person's personality, they just may not be a future oriented person. They may be very present oriented, right? Very in the moment. I'm going to make a decision based on where I'm at now instead of being more planful. Assess the client's decision-making approach. So how good or how much of a process do they have for making a decision? And finally, assess the client's satisfaction with the career counseling process and the career counselor's effectiveness. And so this is where you want to see if what you're doing is working and if you're really meeting your client's needs. So those might be some of the reasons why you would want to use an assessment, and you can see they're very different. And so you, again, want to be intentional about making sure that you have determined why you want to give an assessment, and then determine whether or not the assessment you have chosen fits into that why, right? Is it lining up with your goal? You want to choose the type of assessment, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, most appropriate for you, your client, and the setting that gets to the information or understanding you are wanting. Okay? So you may find that for you, you aren't qualified to use some of the quantitative assessments. You haven't been trained, you don't have the access to it, and so you're not going to be able to use it. So you're going to have to adjust what you choose based on your access and your comfort level with it. Again, your client, which we've talked about, the goal that your client has, the need your client has, and the setting. So again, considering, whether you're going to be working with the client on the individual level, is it going to be a long-term relationship or just a one-session deal? Are you going into classrooms? Are you doing, again, kind of large scale, maybe school-wide assessments? In which case you're going to have to choose your assessments appropriately, right? Let's look specifically at the quantitative assessments right now. The quantitative assessments are typically used with traditional theories, like I mentioned, the theories that are focused more on job choice or job placement. Okay, so with a lot of these quantitative assessments, your client is going to take the assessment and then they're going to come out with some careers that fit with the results. So these might be like the strong interest inventory, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Those are both really well-known, well-used quantitative assessments. Quantitative assessments are commonly used in computer-guided career counseling. So these are programs that pretty much do it all. Programs like Career Cruising, where you have a student go in, they take an assessment, and then maybe multiple assessments. Some of them do like a interest inventory, a skills assessment, and so on. And then they offer options for careers based on the results. And then they're really cool. A lot of them are, especially the better ones. But they then will lead the individual to the next steps of the career process. So give them information on careers. So they'll give them careers and then give them access to information. And a lot of them, like I said, are really cool. They have like videos in there so they can do research and maybe build their own portfolio based on, the research they've done and the assessments they've taken. Essentially, though, these are designed to be used without a person or a career counselor there. Okay. And so you don't necessarily need to be there to help the individual. Some strengths are that they can be administered and interpreted in groups or by a computer. You don't have to be there to do them necessarily if you're using the computer-guided career counseling, or you can do them in the larger groups or classrooms. It gives clients an answer, like a definitive, you should be this, which some of them hate, but some of them like that. Some individuals, especially, depending on their age, I'm thinking like adolescents or later adolescents like that. They like that answer. They like the idea of being told what to do to some degree. And some of the assessments are really, well researched, again, validated, reliable. They've just been used for years and years and years. So they are really doing what they're supposed to be doing. Some weaknesses is that they aren't tailored to the client. They do require training to administer and interpret, or again, if you have a certain degree, some of the assessments consider you to be trained, and you'll find that information usually on the website or like in the booklet. It'll give you information about going to training to administer the assessments and interpret them, or it will tell you if you're qualified to do so. And then another weakness is that it does give clients an answer, which, as I've talked about over the course of these different episodes, is not necessarily a good thing, because it implies that this is what they should be, and it implies that they can maybe be this, right? Which doesn't take into account things like culture and skills and financial means and all of those things. And now on to qualitative assessments. These assessments are aligned more with postmodern theories like narrative, relational cultural theory. These are assessments like the career story interview I've talked about, narrative timelines, card sorts, anything that does not give an answer. Okay, so anything that is dependent upon the client to be completed. That would be considered a qualitative assessment. Some strengths is that it gives you quality information. So it's going to give you more than just the results of an assessment, of a quantitative assessment. Okay. Quantitative assessment is going to be very structured, the results you're going to get. And you're going to have to spend some time interpreting the information so that it is more personal to the person in front of you. Qualitative assessments are already designed to do that, and it's going to give you a full picture of the person in front of you. They include cultural considerations in their administration and interpretation, so there's no need to take some extra time to consider how appropriate the assessment is for the culture of your client, because that's what that's already kind of part of it. Right? You're going and you're getting quality information. And so you're looking and listening to the person in front of you to do anything. And so culture is just a part of it, a natural part of these assessments. Weaknesses, they do require training or at least familiarity to administer and interpret. I think a lot of times because they aren't those standardized assessments, people think that you can just jump into using a qualitative assessment, which you can essentially. But if you've not used qualitative assessments before, it's a lot harder than you think. And so you have to do practice. Ideally, you are administering these assessments under supervision first so that you are getting feedback on how you're interpreting the information, how you're administering it, how the process is going. So you don't just want to jump into something. You want to make sure that you're really putting some thought and some research and, again, ideally supervision into these types of assessments. They do take more time. Okay, so quantitative assessments are, kind of time consuming, but they can take the assessment outside of the session. So they can take the assessment on their own and then just come to you for the interpretation. Qualitative assessments may take an entire session just to do the assessment, let alone the next steps. Okay, so a lot of times qualitative assessments are more involved, and so they may require multiple sessions to really get to what the client needs. They are challenging to administer in larger groups. And so if you're doing like those large scale, maybe school-wide or classroom-wide assessments, I'm not saying you can't do them. You are just going to need to consider how you do them a little bit more. And so they aren't, I certainly prefer qualitative assessments, but they aren't the end-all be-all. They definitely require, like I said, a certain level of ability to use them, and also the context has to be right? You have to have the time and the access to individuals to use them. And finally, some things to consider, just some kind of my last thoughts on the use of assessments. Don't administer and interpret a quantitative assessment unless you're qualified to do so. Like I mentioned, it usually requires training or a certain degree. It's just unethical to do that. If a quantitative assessment isn't the appropriate version, okay? So if you're doing an interest inventory that is free, you found it on the internet, it's not the version that has been researched and validity and reliability has been reported on it. So you don't want to treat it as if it's a quantitative assessment. Okay, whenever you use it, and I'm not saying you can't use it, certainly use it. Not all of us have access to the I call them the real, but the researched versions, the original versions of the assessments. Some of them are expensive. But if you don't have that access, treat it as a qualitative assessment when you interpret the results, okay? Don't just give the client the results and assume that that they are correct. And so you'll want to treat it more as a qualitative assessment. Really go to the client whenever you're doing the interpretation. Listen to them. Allow them to understand, help them understand what it means, and what it means in terms of them, not what it means in terms of the assessment. Okay? Don't just jump into qualitative assessments. You still want to use them intentionally, making sure you know how and why they are used. So still have that purpose behind the assessments, okay? You still have a goal with the assessments. You don't just want to pull all these tools out of your toolbox and kind of randomly use them. You want to make sure that you're using them intentionally. Obviously, my preference is to use qualitative assessments because they do multiple things. They give you information, they build rapport, they consider cultural differences, etc. However, again, they aren't the end-all be-all, and I certainly use quantitative assessments depending on the client. Okay, so if the client has a need that I feel a quantitative assessment is going to fulfill, then I will use a quantitative assessment or a traditional approach to career counseling. You can still add those things into quantitative assessments, okay? So quantitative assessments can still be culturally sensitive if you use a little creativity. All right, so a lot of times I will again use traditional approaches or more quantitative type assessments, but when I interpret them, like I mentioned above, I will use a little bit of creativity to turn them more into a qualitative assessment, especially during the interpretation, to really tailor it to the individual. Finally, I urge you to be intentional and cautious in using quantitative assessments with large groups. Again, it's easy, and we see this a lot because it gives a lot of people access to career counseling. However, it can, I think, in the way I was trained or taught when I was working at the Career Counseling Center to do these large scale assessments was very, it was time consuming. But it was also, I feel, much more ethical than just kind of giving out these assessments and doing the interpretation without spending a lot of time with the individual student reports. And so what we would do is we would do interpretations of the strong interest inventory in large groups, and what we would do is before we met with the groups, we would print off the individual reports for everyone, and we would take time to go through each individual report to see what the results looked like. Okay, so if we thought there was anything off with the results, if they were, and I'm not going into again the specific assessments necessarily, but if the results were low or it's called flat, if they really didn't have a good solid result, we would make notes on it. Don't pay attention to your assessment because essentially the results are going to be meaningless. And I want you to follow up with me for an individual appointment. Okay, so we would make notes on those interpretations, and we would pull out those students who had results that we felt like wouldn't be really good for them. Okay, so we didn't just blindly give the information to people and do the interpretation. We spent a lot of time going through those reports before we administered them. Sometimes if we had, I remember one time in particular, we had a large group of we were doing this for athletes, and we had a large group of students who had what's called those flat results, where they didn't really have any results at all. And so we just pulled them out separately. And so two of us did the interpretation. One of us did the interpretation of the strong interest inventory, and then I did a smaller group, and I was able to do a qualitative assessment with those individuals in the small group. And so it, again, it was more time consuming than you may have available to you, but it was a much more ethical and effective way of using quantitative assessments in large groups. So I encourage you to really, again, be creative with how you use quantitative assessments, not in the administering and interpretation of them necessarily, because again, if it's, that standardized version of it, you have to follow things by the book. But in the interpretation and in the teaching of the, the theory and the why behind the tool, you can certainly be creative in that. And finally, I realize this episode is a bit shorter than other ones. I opted to not talk specifically about the different assessments, but to give you a broader view of using assessments in career counseling. Assessment is a large part of career counseling, but I firmly believe we should not just jump into assessing because that's just what career counselors do. Rather, you should move forward intentionally and choose assessments with purpose, administering and interpreting them ethically and effectively.